Part 2. Flawed Forensics. 3. False ID. In the future world depicted in the 1989 film Back to the Future 2, people use their fingerprints to access everything. Fictional high school student Marty McFly, played by Michael J. Fox, travels to the then exotic year 2015, where people use fingerprints for identification, to unlock doors, and to pay for things. In that fictional future, bandits amputate fingers to gain access to the victims' homes and bank accounts. In our world, criminals hack computers rather than fingers. Our fingerprints do not control everything, because while fingerprints are reasonably effective for biometric identification purposes, they are not perfect. Fingerprints can unlock smartphones, and Apple Pay and Android Pay have used them. However, Apple researchers calculated an error rate of 1 in 50,000 for its iPhone fingerprint system. Phones only capture partial prints, since the scanners are quite small. Users can experience errors if the screen is dirty or if fingertips are wet. As a result, many people cannot open their phone on the first or second try. Due to the high incidence of errors, newer devices adopt face scans. The stakes for such biometrics are usually small. A phone, frustratingly, does not open on the first try. In criminal cases, however, life and liberty are at stake, and unfortunately, it is not possible to match fingerprints. In fact, the term match is misleading, if what is meant is a perfect hit. A certain conclusion that a pattern in fact came from a particular object. The word match is not used today by well-trained forensics professionals. Indeed, at the FBI, supervisors instructed hair and fiber examiners not to use the word match after the O.J. Simpson trial, where the judge barred an FBI examiner's use of the word regarding hair evidence. Instead, examiners now use terms like identification, with quite detailed accompanying definitions. What the terminology obscures is that any comparison of fingerprint evidence, or any other pattern evidence for that matter, involves some degree of uncertainty. An examiner making a decision relies on objective information, like measurements, but also subjective judgments, like an inner conviction or a personal point of certainty. Any decision that a person makes has an error rate. You will learn that for many forensic techniques, even fingerprinting, error rates can be so high that if you had thought these were at least nearly perfect matches, you will be shocked. In this chapter, I will tell the story of how fingerprinting evolved, from claims of infallibility to revelations of error. I tell the story of the fingerprint errors in Brandon Mayfield's case, and unpack how errors can occur in fingerprinting generally. I conclude by arguing that examiners must always express uncertainty and present evidence using research-based probabilities. The notion of a perfect forensic identification must be exposed as a myth and discarded. The Pharaoh Murders. Fingerprints have been used for identification purposes for thousands of years. Clay tablets documenting business deals in ancient Babylon featured fingerprint impressions. In Qin Dynasty China, handprints were used in criminal investigations. In 1788, a German doctor, J.C.A. Mayer, was perhaps the first to conclude that fingerprints are unique. He added a more cautious note, though, explaining, although the arrangement of skin ridges is never duplicated in two persons, nevertheless the similarities are closer among some individuals. British colonial authorities began using handprints on a large scale in India as a tool to enforce their contracts. Fingerprinting then made its way to Scotland Yard. The murder of shopkeepers Thomas and Anne Pharaoh in southeast London led in 1905 to the first murder trial using fingerprint evidence. The attackers bludgeoned the Pharaohs, and one left a greasy fingerprint on the emptied cash box to their store. A local milkman saw two young men near the store that day. He couldn't make an identification, but people in the neighborhood saw the brothers Albert and Alfred Stratton in the area. Inspector Charles Collins from Scotland Yard, which had just started using fingerprint identifications in 1901, said he found 11 points of similarity between the prints. As Professor Simon Cole recounts, the inspector explained at trial that as few as 4 points of similarity would have been enough, based on his personal experience at Scotland Yard, where he had seen different fingerprints that shared 3 points of similarity, but not 4. Just 4 points would be considered shockingly weak evidence today. The jury convicted the Stratton brothers, who were hanged that same day. A few years later in the United States, the murder trial of Thomas Jennings hinged on a fingerprint. The examiner from the police department said Jennings, and Jennings only, could have left the prints. The appeals judges agreed this was proper evidence, because the method is in such general and common use. Jennings was hanged. During that time, writers began to feature fingerprinting in their depictions of criminal investigations. As the Mark Twain character Pudd'nhead Wilson said in a fictional murder trial in small-town Mississippi, "Every human being carries with him from his cradle to his grave certain physical marks which do not change their character and by which he can always be identified, and that without shade of doubt or question." Twain was inspired by Arthur Conan Doyle's short stories in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes to include fingerprinting in his story. Sherlock Holmes noticed a thumb mark on a letter in the early story The Sign of the Four, but never conducted a fingerprint comparison. Since then, police have used fingerprints in thousands of cases around the world. By the 1940s, FBI agents kept over 100 million fingerprint cards in paper files. Today, far larger computerized databases of fingerprints are kept by local, state, and national law enforcement worldwide. Fingerprints have entered popular culture as the first forensic technique to uniquely identify individuals. Especially in the early days of DNA testing, people referred to it as DNA fingerprinting. Such was the cultural power of fingerprints. Fingerprints became connected to the very idea of individuality. Elvis Presley said, "Values are like fingerprints. Nobody's the same, but you leave them all over everything you do." Or as David Sedaris put it with more snark, "All of us take pride and pleasure in the fact that we are unique, but I'm afraid that when all is said and done, the police are right. It all comes down to fingerprints." A single print. While our fingerprints are very detailed, we do not leave the same impression every time we touch something. If you have ever had to roll prints for a background check, you will be asked to roll them carefully. Sometimes they will ask you to roll the prints again, because you did not leave an acceptable image. Obviously, a person committing a crime is not trying to leave a good print, and is unlikely to neatly roll a finger from left to right to create a smooth pattern on a nice flat surface that preserves a print well. Fingerprints found at crime scenes are often not visible to the naked eye. Hidden prints are called latent prints. It can take dusting with powder or other development techniques to make them visible. Although fingerprints have been used in major criminal investigations for over 100 years, perhaps the most famous fingerprint image ever is the latent print that Spanish police found on the bag with 7 detonators inside an abandoned van near the May 2004 terrorist bombings of commuter trains in Madrid, Spain. As you know from the introduction, the FBI searched government fingerprint databases and fixed on the fingerprint of a lawyer in Portland, Oregon, named Brandon Mayfield. The FBI did not just search fingerprints from criminal arrests, but also searched its databases of suspected terrorists and its civil file, with fingerprints taken from government employees and military service members. The FBI analyst ran the database search and received a list of 20 candidate prints. The analyst began with the first and best candidate, and when he reached the fourth print in the list, he decided that it looked good and stopped there. He then ordered a copy of Mayfield's inked 10-print card to get a better quality version of the print for a further comparison. It may surprise you to hear that today's computerized fingerprint databases do not claim to accurately determine the source of a print. If the operator enters your prints, the program will generate a list of prints that most resemble yours, according to the designer's parameters. How the search program works, and what measurements its algorithm uses, is typically not shared by the company that designed it, not even with the labs using it. Unlike what you see on TV, a hit is not displayed instantly on a screen. Instead, human experts must still do a lot of painstaking work. They must examine each of the candidate prints suggested by the database search. Sometimes none of the candidate prints offered by the database resemble the crime scene prints. On crime shows, a whole team of experts spends all of their time on a single case, conveniently wrapped up at the end of an episode. In real crime labs, experts can struggle under serious backlogs and may work on hundreds of cases at a time. The Madrid bombing investigation was so important, though, that the case proceeded more like on TV, in that 3 separate FBI examiners looked at the prints. When the first examiner looked at the 10-print card, he felt it confirmed his prior determination. Note that when he ran the Madrid bombing print in the database, Mayfield's print appeared fourth. That might tend to indicate that he was not the best candidate. However, when the examiner looked at Mayfield's prints in more detail, he found 15 points, or minute details, that corresponded to the latent print. Next, 2 examiners, a supervisor and a retired FBI examiner with over 30 years of experience, verified the conclusion. Normally, there would be just one verifier, but in a high-profile case like this, the FBI asked 2 people to verify the conclusion. There was an area to the upper left with some differences. This area gave one of the examiners heartburn from the get-go. However, ultimately they all decided that it was in fact Mayfield's print. Now the FBI ordered a full-court press. Concerned that Mayfield was part of a second wave of terrorist attacks, they ordered 24-hour surveillance. The FBI was 100% positive that this was his print. All 3 examiners agreed. As the examiners did their work, they looked back and forth between Mayfield's print and the print from the bombing scene. As they looked back and forth, they changed which points they marked. One examiner changed 5 of his original 7 points, which he had marked on the latent print, only after he looked at Mayfield's prints. This was reverse reasoning. The examiners changed their conclusions and found new similarities as they looked back and forth. To be sure, Mayfield's lawyers hired their own fingerprint expert, who looked at the print too. The defense expert has described how he began work on the case, comparing each of Mayfield's prints, one at a time, to the latent print from the bombing. So I started with the thumb, went to the index, went to the middle. No. Boom, I come up with one. Ah, here's one with a couple of similarities, a couple of more. By the time I got to 15, I said, "This looks like an identification." Just like the 2 analysts knew that the first FBI analyst had found an identification, this defense expert also knew that the FBI had concluded it was Mayfield's print. In court, the defense expert told the judge, "I compared the latent prints to the known prints that were submitted on Brandon Mayfield, and I concluded that the latent print is the left index finger of Mr. Mayfield." Mayfield's own expert agreed with the FBI. Mayfield later recalled, "He actually confirmed what the other 3 examiners had said. And from that point on, I kind of felt like the train to a death penalty just pulled out of the station." The term that the FBI examiners used was individualization. This meant that Mayfield, and not anyone else in the entire world, left the print. A conclusion of individualization, as the FBI put it at the time, was supported by theories of biological uniqueness and permanence, as well as more than 100 years of operational experience. Fingerprints are unique, the experts would, and still do say. After all, for over a century, fingerprint examiners have done their work well. Fingerprint examiners claim to be infallible. The method had an error rate of 0. Fingerprints are unique, after all. Everyone knows that fingerprints are unique. This means that no other person in the world could be the culprit. At the first court hearing, Mayfield told the judge, "That's not my fingerprint, Your Honor." The judge rejected this defense. How could the fingerprint not be his, when 4 experts had agreed 100%? The judge ordered Mayfield arrested as a material witness to terrorism. Yet the fingerprint analysts were all wrong. Mayfield's print has some similarities in common with the Madrid print, but there are also specific differences between the two prints, which the experts all discounted. And consider how Mayfield first became a suspect. He was not detained near the crime scene or linked by a witness. Instead, his print was pulled from a database containing tens of millions of prints. Such databases are designed to locate prints that have as many similarities as possible, which makes the job of the expert far more challenging. The latent print from the bag of detonators was smudged and missing an awful lot of information. There may be over 100 points in a pristine print, but the 3 FBI experts were impressed to find just 15. Meanwhile, the Spanish authorities told the FBI that the FBI had it wrong, 3 weeks before Mayfield's arrest. The FBI responded that they had absolute confidence. Indeed, the FBI agents were so sure that when the Spanish authorities responded, on April 13, 2004, that they believed the comparison was negative, the agents flew to Madrid on April 21st with enlarged photographs to present their work in person and try to convince the Spanish investigators to change their minds. Mayfield had never been to Spain. The FBI began intensive surveillance and searches of his home, finding only that his daughter had written a middle school report on Spain. He was Muslim, which no doubt contributed to the FBI's intense suspicion. The FBI arrested Mayfield on May 6th and proceeded with a terrorism case until the Spanish authorities on May 19th informed the FBI they had connected the fingerprints to a known Algerian terrorist. The next day, on May 20th, the FBI agreed to release Mayfield, and days later, charges were dropped. The FBI eventually apologized. In 2006, Mayfield settled a civil rights case against the FBI for $1.9 million. The case would forever change forensic science in the United States and beyond. After all, these were experienced FBI analysts examining fingerprints, which are supposed to be unique. If a fingerprint examination can be so badly botched in an incredibly high-profile case, then how easily can something else go wrong? The methods of latent fingerprint comparison. You can quickly get a sense of what fingerprint examiners do from a description, but the work itself is challenging and tedious. It is not easy on the eyes. One must spend many hours classifying and examining prints. At first, one works on 10 print cards taken from suspects. Next, one graduates to examination of latent prints, or hidden prints from unknown persons found at crime scenes. Fingerprints are formed before birth. These ridges cover not only our fingertips, but also the entire underside of our fingers and hands and feet. These skin ridges are called friction skin. Our skin is usually covered with a thin film of perspiration or oil. When the finger or hand touches an item, a reproduction of those ridges is left by means of that perspiration or oil. That reproduction is called a latent print. How good the print is may depend on the type of surface. Some surfaces, such as metal or glass, can preserve a sharp image of a print. Other surfaces, like cloth, may preserve little to nothing. An ideal surface for preserving prints, like glass, can be wiped down. A print is only preserved if the object is undisturbed. The shape of the surface can distort the print. The way a person touches an object also affects how good the print is. As noted, people committing a crime do not normally try to leave a well-formed latent print. Further, while everyone has ridges on their fingers, some people tend not to leave clear prints. Some people have shallow ridges on their fingers, making it hard to leave prints. Scarring and wear can also change one's fingerprints. People who work with their hands a lot do not leave clear fingerprints. In the first level of the analysis, the examiner classifies the overall shape of the print. The latent print from the Madrid case has what fingerprint examiners call an arch, and the name is self-explanatory. The ridges form an arch shape. The other two shapes are a circular pattern called a whorl and a U-shaped loop. The second level focuses on smaller details called features or minutiae. The work that follows is subjective and based on experience. The examiner looks at the print and identifies these finer details, including places where ridges end, enclosures or islands occur, or other features. This examination process sometimes takes many hours, particularly if the print is highly incomplete. There are terms for many commonly observed details, like a crossover if ridges form an X shape, a delta if ridges come together in a V, a ridge ending if a ridge comes to an end, and an island if there is a spot-shaped ridge surrounded by another ridge. The third level of detail refers to even smaller features, such as ends of ridges and shapes created by the pores in the skin. It is not common for such details to be present in a latent print. In the 1990s, fingerprint examiners developed a new terminology for their work, calling it ACE-V, which stands for Analysis, Comparison, Evaluation, and Verification. This acronym simply means that examiners look at the prints carefully, compare them, reach a conclusion, and ask someone else to provide confirmation. It is not exactly a method. It is more like a set of very general steps. No fancy equipment is necessarily used either. In some labs, examiners still squint through a single ocular glass, think Mr. Peanut, while in others they take photos of the prints and look at them blown up on a computer screen. During this process, the examiner first determines whether the latent print is suitable for comparison, based on whether there is adequate information in it. Many prints that police lift at crime scenes are not suitable for comparison. They are too smudged or distorted to be of any use. In a study that I worked on with colleagues, including several examiners at the Houston Forensic Science Center, we found that over half of the latent prints, 56%, that the lab received were found to be no value or not suitable for comparison. If the print is of high enough quality to work with, then the comparison process begins. There may be, in fact, a number of latent prints from a crime scene. In the Houston lab, for example, while most cases had just one print, the median case had 4 prints, the average was over 8 prints, and a few outlier cases had as many as 150 latent prints. The latent prints may be compared to the prints of a suspect, if there is one. The prints from a suspect will be pristine 10-print cards. If there is no suspect, the examiner conducts a search in a database, which will suggest a series of candidate prints. The examiner must still go through the list of possibilities carefully. To do this, The examiner traditionally makes a side-by-side comparison between the latent print and prints taken from a suspect. They look at them both using a magnifying glass, or today, more commonly, by looking at images on a computer screen. Next, the examiner evaluates the degree of similarity between the latent and the known prints, reaching one of three seemingly firm conclusions: that they are from the same source, from different sources, or that the comparison is wholly inconclusive. A good lab will have procedures for documenting this process. The examiner may mark each feature relied on, sometimes using a computer program. If one looks at prints side by side, one may tend to look for similarities and ignore differences. Some labs now require the examiner to mark up the latent print first, and then the comparison print. Other labs do not require any type of marking or documentation. If the examiner decides that the prints could have come from the same person, then the prints are passed to another examiner to verify or re-examine that conclusion. In most labs, another examiner conducts a verification only if an identification was found. The verifying examiner can see all of the results and any documentation by the first examiner. Few labs do this blind, where the verifier does a totally independent analysis and does not know what conclusion was reached by the first examiner. Untested assumptions. No one has carefully tested the basic assumptions that experts have relied upon for decades. First, are each person's fingerprints unique? You have probably long assumed that fingerprints are unique, and that no two are alike. My colleague Gregory Mitchell and I surveyed two groups of over 1,200 adults in the United States, and we found that 95% believed fingerprints are unique, a higher percentage than those who thought DNA results were unique. People think fingerprints are like snowflakes. In fact, now scientists have found that there are 35 basic shapes snowflakes may form, and that snowflakes that form under similar conditions will form similar and sometimes nearly identical shapes. Fingerprint examiners similarly assume that all fingerprint patterns are completely different from each other, and not just that they are somewhat or mostly different from each other. Experts made the same strong assumption about bite marks, fibers, tool marks, shoe prints, and a range of other types of forensics. We do not know if that strong assumption is true for fingerprints. It has never been tested. We do have good reasons, however, to suspect that, like for snowflakes, these other types of prints may sometimes look quite alike, at least at certain levels of detail. Second, how often can one person's fingerprint look like another person's crime scene latent print? We do not know how often a smeared, partial latent fingerprint from a crime scene might look very much like someone else's print. It may depend on what level of detail one has in a print. We now know that errors can happen. Third, how good are experts at making fingerprint comparisons? We need to know the error rates. After all, we are trusting experts to make decisions that can send people to prison or even death row. The U.S. Department of Justice standards explain that a fingerprint identification is a statement of an examiner's belief. The National Academy of Sciences report emphasized fingerprint examiners rely on a subjective assessment that lacks adequate statistical models. We do not know how common or rare it is to have particular features in a fingerprint. As a result, the NAS concluded that ACE-V is not specific enough to qualify as a validated method. Fourth, we might assume that technology, like databases, will catch errors that fallible people make. However, in the Mayfield case, the technology contributed to his wrongful identification. In fact, modern databases may increase the challenges experts face because by design they search through millions of records to produce the best candidates, images that look as similar to each other as possible. Fortunately, as I will describe, research and technology can address these challenges but only if we let better science come into the lab and the courtroom. Comparing everything. Fingerprints leave very detailed information, if the print is a good one. But experts also examine far less promising evidence. Our shoes are mass-produced objects, and unless one has very unusual shoes, like the Bruno Magli size 12 Lorenzo shoe print at issue in the trial of O.J. Simpson, one might share the same shoe print as hundreds of thousands of others. Nevertheless, experts testify to unique patterns of wear on a person's shoes. Experts compare tool marks, asking whether a firearm could have fired a particular shell casing, or whether a set of pliers could have cut a wire. Experts compare fibers, human hairs, and even animal hairs. Experts also compare more obscure objects. A man was convicted of murder in Indiana in 2 separate 1990s trials based on a garbage bag comparison. The expert testified that irregularities in a roll of garbage bags can extend from one bag to the next, and that the bag used to wrap the victim shared unique similarities, showing that it was connected to and a part of the bag from the defendant's home. Experts compare masking tape and duct tape. Experts compare cloth and clothing, studying lines on a plaid shirt or jeans in relation to clothes seen in a photo or video. In one case, an FBI image analysis expert claimed that even though it was a mass-produced shirt, only 1 in 650 billion shirts would randomly match so precisely, adding, give or take a few billion. Such pattern comparison techniques are still in use, and yet they lack adequate data. And for none of these techniques can the experts say what a conclusion based on them actually means. They cannot tell you how often such objects might coincidentally share similarities. They cannot tell you how likely it is that the evidence came from the source, and if they do, the numbers they offer, give or take a few billion, are made up. Instead, these matchmakers just assert a personal opinion that evidence came from the same source. Firearms. Of all the pattern comparison techniques used, firearms comparisons are perhaps the most common, possibly even more so than fingerprint comparisons. Firearms violence is a major problem in the United States, with over 10,000 homicides involving firearms and almost 500,000 other crimes, such as robberies and assaults, committed using firearms. Firearms comparisons are in great demand. Examiners seek to link crime scene evidence, such as spent shell casings or bullets, with a firearm. The assumption is that manufacturing processes used to cut, drill, and grind a gun leave markings on the barrel, breech face, and firing pin. When the firearm discharges, those components contact the ammunition and leave marks on it. Experts have assumed different firearms should leave different tool marks on the ammunition, even if firearms are produced on the same production line. They believe these tool marks allow them to definitively link spent ammunition to a single firearm. For over 100 years, firearms experts have testified in criminal trials. Firearms experts traditionally testified in court by making uniqueness claims, much like those made about fingerprints. Experts said that no two firearms should produce the same microscopic features on bullets and cartridge cases, such that they could be falsely identified as having been fired from the same firearm. By the late 1990s, experts premised testimony on a theory of identification set out by a professional association, the Association of Firearms and Toolmark Examiners, AFTE. AFTE instructs practitioners to use the phrase source identification to explain what they mean when they identify sufficient agreement when examining firearms. At a general level, these firearms examiners examine markings that a firearm leaves on a discharged bullet or cartridge casing. The AFTE's so-called theory is circular. An identification occurs when the expert finds sufficient evidence defined as enough evidence to find an identification. In recent years, scientists have called into question the validity and reliability of such testimony. In a 2008 report on ballistic imaging, the National Academy of Sciences concluded that definitive associations like source identification were not supported. In its 2009 report, the NAS followed up and stated that categorical conclusions regarding firearms or tool marks were not supported by research, and that instead, more cautious claims should be made. The report stated that the scientific knowledge base for tool mark and firearms analysis is fairly limited. The AFTE theory of identification is inadequate and does not explain how an expert can reach a given level of confidence in a conclusion. Judges have also raised concerns that this theory represents unconstrained subjectivity masquerading as objectivity. It is inherently vague and subjective, or either tautological or wholly subjective. To this day, however, firearms examiners use terms like source identification in court, although, as I will describe in Chapter 5, judges have begun to step in and require more cautious wording, such as that it is more likely than not that the ammunition came from the defendant's firearm, or that the firearm cannot be excluded. The Department of Justice announced guidelines in 2019. Experts should use the term source identification, which they define as an examiner's conclusion that two tool marks originated from the same source. The guidelines sound much like the AFTE theory. Examiners may call it an identification when they decide that it is one. The wake of the Mayfield error. The Mayfield fingerprint error was a watershed event in the history of the FBI and in the modern history of forensic science. Imagine how many other people have been convicted where no independent scientists were examining the evidence. Fingerprint examiners long claimed an error rate of 0. A 1963 FBI report called The Science of Fingerprints began with an introductory letter by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, singing the praises of the science of fingerprinting. Of all the methods of identification, fingerprinting alone has proved to be both infallible and feasible. The 3 FBI examiners each gave a 100% positive identification. Yet the experts all got it wrong. In the investigation that followed, the FBI did make 2 changes. First, in cases with just a single latent fingerprint, the FBI said there should be a blind verification, which means a second expert looks at the prints and independently evaluates them. This was an important change, but many cases involve more than one latent fingerprint. Second, the FBI also changed the side-by-side comparison process, which can lead to circular reasoning. FBI examiners now examine the latent and suspect prints one at a time, rather than side by side. The terminology used by fingerprint examiners has also changed in response to the Mayfield case. In 2017, the Department of Justice wrote up a model standard for fingerprint testimony, which states that examiners should not assert 100% level of certainty or claim they have a 0 error rate. The examiner should not brag about the numbers of cases handled or use terms like reasonable scientific certainty. The term individualization should not be used. This move was embraced by many in the community as part of a constant evolution to improve fingerprinting practices. However, the standards still state that an examiner should testify that the prints originated from the same source. This is defined as an examiner's decision that the observed features have sufficient correspondence. The fingerprint examiner can offer a conclusion of source identification. The approved term, identification, still sounds an awful lot like individualization or a unique connection to a particular person. The examiner still claims that the prints originated from the same source. Moreover, these are only federal standards. In state courts, fingerprint examiners still pronounce that a print definitely came from the defendant. These differences in the words that fingerprint examiners use may not mean much. The most important word that an examiner says may be the word fingerprint. Once jurors hear that the expert looked at fingerprints and found some kind of connection between them, the 100+ years of cultural association between fingerprints and unique individuality come into play. People do not know about all of the assumptions and subjectivity in the method. As one fingerprint examiner put it, when we say, "I am 100% certain of my conclusion," we might mean that we have conducted a careful examination, reached the best conclusion possible with the data available, and that we would not have reported that conclusion unless we were confident that we had done our work well. Fingerprint examiner Heidi Elridge asks, "But what does the jury hear? They hear, 'I'm an expert, and I'm telling you that this conclusion is fact and cannot possibly be wrong.'" Probabilities. Forensic experts should reach conclusions using frequencies based on data. The expert should give us a number rather than use words like identification that imply the evidence in fact came from a source. For DNA testing, conclusions are already presented as a population frequency, using statistics. The opposition to such approaches may be both cultural and strategic. In a survey of fingerprint examiners, Simon Cole, Valerie King, and Henry Swafford found that almost all of them currently report fingerprint conclusions in a categorical fashion, as an identification or not. Some admitted that they would prefer to offer probabilistic conclusions, but are reluctant to do so. Over 1/3 agreed that it would be scientifically more appropriate to do so. One commented that adding a numerical value to conclusions will give the jury more information. Almost 80% agreed that jurors might not understand probabilities, or feared that defense lawyers would take advantage of probabilities to sow reasonable doubt. Over 40% admitted they lacked training in probabilities, so would not easily be able to testify about them. Almost half worried that a probabilistic conclusion is too weak when compared to a categorical identification. We are not irrational or gullible people. If we are told the truth, that experts can be wrong, then our attitude changes. It is high time that jurors and lawyers and judges were all actually told, in every case, that experts are not foolproof. All evidence is probabilistic, and nothing is 100% certain. We should be given frequencies. One aspect of that, which I discuss in the next chapter, is the need to be told about the error rates. "I'll preach fingerprints till I die," said the supervising examiner in the Mayfield case. After making the most high-profile error in fingerprint history, the examiner still maintained, "They're infallible. I still consider myself one of the best in the world."